Hello and welcome to another episode of the Revenue Revolution podcast, sponsored by Joint Flows. Today we are joined by Alex Harris. Alex at the moment is at Coupa Software as a mid-market account executive. Welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you very much. Yeah, all good. Very, very warm here in London today. So yeah, all good. Thank you.
Amazing. Tell our listeners a little bit about yourself. Who is Alex Harris?
Yeah, so currently working, as you said, at Coupa Software, so finance, procurement, and supply chain space, and specializing in the life science and biotech industry, which is obviously a very exciting place to be, working with some very cool companies, hopefully trying to solve some very challenging diseases. So yeah, that's a little bit about where I'm Coupa. Outside of work, massive on skiing, you may see on LinkedIn, and
Nice.
yeah, enjoy all things sports. So that's a little bit about me.
Nice. I think Mick's a bit of a skier, so you could probably get on about that. But
I'm not a skier,
I've
so
never been
I don't
skiing.
know where that came from, but
He's a bit of an athlete. I just assume he does everything. All right, let's jump straight into it. So look, Alex, I know before we hit the record, we spoke a little bit about your role and what it entails. We spoke about sales cycles as well. And one of the things you mentioned is it can really range. It can go from 3 months. You've got people in your team who've been doing a sales cycle for a year and a half, for example. Talk a little bit about how you change strategies and what you introduce into the process as that time increases.
Yeah, so I think it's definitely an interesting one. I'm sure that I'm not alone in the sense that the last 6 to 12 months, everyone's seen a bit of an extension in certain sales cycles. I think the cycles where things are moving quickly and there's that kind of velocity, style and side to the deals. You've obviously just got to get your ducks in a row and make sure you're bringing the right people to the table at the right time to ensure that the customer is kind of in a position to buy and move forward quickly. And you've kind of got to roll with that speed and velocity. I think where things start getting more challenging and the process starts elongating itself, I think you become an even more glorified project manager in terms of really understanding and trying to hold businesses and customers and prospects accountable to timelines, but working with them in their timelines as well. Because sometimes, as much as you try and force it and trying to impart urgency in a process, there's just certain things that are going on internally at a business that you can't affect or can't impact in terms of your cycles. I think for me, I'm very structured and I definitely work very closely with mutual action plans, mutual success plans, call it what you want, and really try introduce that early in my sales process and just give them visibility of some of the things that are going to be happening in a sales process, and just so that they can be aware of that. But it also kind of helps you to multi-thread as well from a mutual action plan or success plan, because you can kind of identify other business elements or units or buyers that may be worth bringing in, but also highlight them as and when they're going to need to be involved in a process. The other thing I work and very much focus on is working as a team. So I'm lucky to have solutions consultants, value consultants here at Coupa that I can bring in, as well as obviously sales leadership and other parts of the business that we can bring into a sales process. And we work very closely from a discovery standpoint as a three to really try and understand the problems that we're trying to solve, and then implicate the pain and understand the value of the pain they're trying to solve. And I think something that we do when processes start to get longer and more challenging is we really rely and fall back on the business case we've built with the business, and we really try and get their sign off and their buy-in to the business case, because that just helps us continue to try and urge and motivate the business to try and help them change. And I think the final one is risk, and trying to remove risk off the table. And I think the Jolt Effect does a very good job at explaining why you do that and why it's important to do that. But certainly in the sort of deals that we sell at Coupa and the businesses that we're working with, what we sell is a big change transformation. It's not just a kind of smaller, more commoditized tool. It's a big, potentially up to 6 to 12 month change project. So you really need to be able to demonstrate the risk is not a factor, and that hopefully tries to help them move things along more swiftly. But there is obviously sometimes where you just can't impact the speed at which you operate in, and it's constantly trying to deposit value in that process, whether that's depositing a pre-recorded reference video at some point to try and help them perhaps share that internally, whether that's more demo content, getting videos from some of your executives to their executives, and just constantly trying to familiarize and bring more value, but also then work with other stakeholders that maybe aren't involved in the sales process, end users, start to maybe familiarize them with the fact that you may be coming on board, and just really trying to build a really broad and wide buying committee and big sort of a large number of champions that you potentially can have selling on your behalf internally.
And so Alex, like massive, and that's obviously like best practices through and through. But what I'm really, so obviously aligning stakeholders externally, like building a business case, creating a mutual action plan, falling back on like compelling metrics and the reason to buy is very important. I've experienced having difficulties navigating the deals internally as well as externally, especially when you speak about an enterprise deal. Like, have you seen tactics, successful tactics to do that efficiently internally?
Yes, I think some of the things that I do is bringing in stakeholders early and often to not just get to a stakeholder at the point in which you need them and being like, hey, can you jump on a call? Because more often than not, they're going to want to be brought up to speed on the opportunity, understand what's happening in this deal, who's involved, why they're being brought into the process, and just giving people familiarity and visibility as early as possible of what's happening, and then bringing constant updates to those people that are involved will just serve you much better in the future when you do need to bring someone in at a point in time that there's a kind of a pinch point in the deal. It just really helps navigate that internally. I think that's a big one for me. I've always been quite a big believer in trying to build your brand internally before you need to use someone, and just reaching out to people, trying to understand what they do, how they operate in the business, what their focus is, so that you have a bit of a grasp on who you need and when you need them. And work with your colleagues in your team as well. Other sales guys are probably going to have, or girls are going to have reached out to these people in the past, understand what they wanted to know before they met with a customer, understand how they operate, and that just serves you better in terms of trying to bring the right people in at the right time, and navigate that internal kind of challenge of getting the right resources onto a call or a meeting as and when you can. Because I think that's the really important thing, is that we're kind of sellers, but we're also real kind of orchestrators in terms of bringing the right people to the table as and when we need them.
Yeah, absolutely. Like what I'm curious about is, so if you do that over, a 6-month sales process, then it's manageable, right? You've got only 6 months to look at, and then you can bring in the right people at the right time with a subset of data, a subset of information. But when you've got deals dragging on for like a year and a half, 2 years with like 20 stakeholders externally, how do you make that efficient, that process of sharing the knowledge, transferring the information internally as smooth as possible?
Yeah, so I think internally, it's all about keeping a record of the information, the conversation. I think that's the first thing, is just keeping a record of the information, because that's just the basics. I think the next thing is then making sure that you've always got a real kind of summarized executive level view, and then you've got your fallback detail view, right? Because often your execs you're bringing in, or your senior stakeholders you're bringing in, or internally, don't have the time to go through 2 years worth of notes. They want to know the key things that the business is trying to do from a challenge. What are they trying to solve in terms of a problem? Is there a business case? If so, what is the business case? And what are the challenges we've encountered in the sales process, among other things, of course. But they're going to want to know a high-level summary view. And often these stakeholders and these senior level executives have done this many times before, so they kind of get the picture pretty quickly. They don't need the deep 2-year detailed overview, but they want to know the key things as quickly as possible, so that they can accelerate their understanding on what's going on. I think there's also a piece around the external side that perhaps gets forgotten about sometimes, around how do you keep them and make sure they're informed on what's happened over the 2-year period, because no doubt the customers will forget what you discussed 2 years ago or a year ago in terms of the reason we're meeting, the reasons we're trying to help solve these problems. And I think that trying to make that buyer journey as easy as possible is a massive part of it, because they'll forget so much information that you constantly have to be reminding them, and constantly have to be bringing to the surface around why they're having these conversations, what they're trying to do, what the metrics they're trying to influence are, and then obviously any potential cost of inaction, which is a big thing at the moment, which seems to be on trend, but that's a big one, I think, in terms of trying to accelerate and get those deals that are dragging on to continue moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Very well articulated. I think one of the points that you've touched on quite a bit since we started this conversation is around project management. And if you haven't explicitly said it, you've alluded to it as well in the way that you've been speaking. How early in the process do you begin that project management piece? And what kind of strategies do you deploy to allow you to be successful at it?
Yeah, I mean, I think personally it's as early as possible. I think this is obviously tied into the discovery phase as well a little bit. And I believe massively in discovery as a team, and not just sort of going in as a sales person and trying to carry out as much discovery on your own. But I also think it's a bit of a mindset in terms of the discovery process is continuous, right? But bringing in a number of people into the opportunity in the discovery process as early as possible, helps you qualify harder and faster, and then make sure that you can then, if you are working on a real project, that's when you then transition into project management mode and you can work on the right things and not just project management deals that aren't going to ever close. Then I think in terms of the structure is constant alignment, constant communication between those individuals you're working with. And then it's the mutual success plan that really obviously ensures that the customer is aligned, but you're also aligned internally on the timelines you're working towards, the steps that need to take place. And this can obviously all happen in Salesforce, in Slack, in meetings. But I think it's obviously then taking a record of everything that's been discussed and everyone's roles and responsibilities, as well as obviously then having deal reviews or kind of breakdowns on what's happening with the deal, where are we at, what do we need to do next, and how are we going to get to where we want to get to as the next action out of that next meeting or next conversation we're having with that particular customer. But it's really about structure, and I think capturing that information in a centralized place is obviously important. But then again, communicating it both ways, both externally and internally with the stakeholders you've got involved, to make sure that it's kind of a real project management style approach.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And we spoke about making the buyer journey as easy as possible as well. And one element of that, which you've also mentioned, is around being able to hold the prospect accountable for their actions. And that's something that a lot of people struggle with, because as you rightfully mentioned, we don't always know what's happening over on that side of the fence as well. So what do you do in order to be able to hold that prospect accountable as well? And, there's a lot of times where a prospect's not able to meet the timeline because other priorities might come up and such. So what do you do in those instances as well?
Yeah, so I think there's two parts to that question. Obviously, one is that how do you hold the prospects accountable, and the second part obviously is what happens when it doesn't go right. So in the accountability piece, it's really being quite honest and transparent, and probably having a little bit of a difficult conversation at some point, and not being afraid of that. Kind of like, this is what we need, this is what you need. Let's work together to make sure we do it as and when we say we're going to do it. Because if I get a delay on my side, it impacts my ability to potentially open up resources, open up the ability to bring in additional demos or bring in additional resources that you require us to bring in. And just having that open, transparent conversation with the prospect and saying, look, we do this every day. It's very rare, seldom that you probably buy something like Coupa. So please, let us try and advise and guide you on why it's important to try and maintain the deadlines we set out. But then I think it's also about tying it to the reason they're doing something. I think I got taught this very early on in my career around businesses only do things for one of four reasons: make money, save money, reduce risk, or become compliant. And you've constantly got to be trying to tie the reason that there's steps and accountability for the next steps to the reason they're doing something. And it's the way that you tie that to the end goal, and try and obviously capture the metrics up front in discovery that enable you to communicate why, if they delay by a month, 2 months, 3 months, there's going to be an impact. What's the impact? Well, let's say, for example, it's the inability to go public. I mean, that's a lot of the time we tie to compliance and SOX controls, because we have businesses that are working towards an IPO. Now, obviously, that's a really easy way to tie again. Well, look, there's a goal you've got to set yourselves of going live or going public by a certain date. We've got to work back from that. And I think it's always about working back from the date, but then really clearly communicating the steps that need to take place and adding some contingency in there, because it's also often that we say, here's the go live date you're trying to get to, and then it never happens because there's delays or there's impact in the implementation phase or in the sales process. And it's all about trying to educate the buyer, because often the buyers don't have the insight that you have from doing this every day, because they can buy software every day. So that's the thing I think is just educating, because yes, you will have some CFOs that have bought many pieces of technology before, but you'll also have the middle level management that just don't do it often and need that help and guidance on how to actually buy software. And that's where we have to come in over that. And I hate the term, but the strategic advisor piece on trying to advise the customer on how to buy software, because that's often the greatest challenge we face in software sales.
Yeah, good.
Absolutely. I think just to wrap that piece up, and what we're seeing as well is that the tenure of the individuals who are buying often isn't one where they've actually bought a solution for the company that they're at previously. So a lot of the time they're actually learning that process as they're going through it. So that whole expertise point of view that you bring forward as someone who's selling it all the time is extremely important.
Alex, I'm really curious about, so you obviously speaking the right game, and you've got all the all the angles covered, but I'm really curious about your evolution from SDR to basically an enterprise AE within a very short period of time. Like, how do you consistently put your best foot forward for a promotion and to get to that bigger role, basically?
Yeah, so I think it kind of probably goes back a little bit before I actually started my career, and that I took a sandwich year or a placement year working in graduate recruitment, which kind of really sharpened me up in terms of how to operate in a commercial environment before I was actually in a real commercial environment, because I was still kind of studying alongside that. I think that year was then transformative for me in terms of my career, but it then also meant that the final year of my university degree, I knew exactly what I wanted to do, which was become an SDR at a tech company. And I then started really educating myself on what it was going to take, what it looks like. And that at that point, I really identified that identifying and finding a mentor was going to be like absolutely crucial. And I then found my first SDR role, was a first on the ground in EMEA for an early stage cybersecurity company. I kind of had to really build a function from scratch myself. And I leveraged a lot of my communities like SDRs of London, AEs of London, and those kind of communities very heavily in the initial phases, just to try and understand what was going on, how I should operate in this world. And then started taking career advice and worked with a mentor very closely, who was a CRO of a fast growth tech company in the UK. And that's when I started to really understand and develop a plan of what I wanted to do and how I wanted to get there. And I then, going back to accountability on the prospect side, it's about building a plan, getting sign off on a plan from your management team, and holding them accountable to the plan you built out. In my SDR days, I was kind of consistently performing and kind of really, the first piece is like, yes, perform and overachieve your target. The second piece is then identify the skills that you have in your current job that obviously serve you well in your next job. But then it's identifying the skills gap and building a bit of a kind of skills matrix of what do you need in an SDR role, what do you need in your future role, and how are you going to bridge the gap between SDR to AE. I was then lucky enough that because we were an early stage company, my VP of sales sort of said, well, look, it doesn't make sense to promote you right now. What you can do is kind of take a hybrid SDR AE role and build you into the role of a kind of over a 6-month period where you start to continue doing your SDR work, focus on that, get paid on the work that you do as an SDR, because naturally a lot of AEs don't reckon, or people that are jumping from SDR to AE realize the potential for, oh, my commission tap's turned off, where's my money gone? I'm not earning any money and I'm not closing any deals, and you're also learning on how to close deals. So that 6-month period was really transformational in terms of having the kind of SDR piece, but also learning and working on some early stage deals to understand and transfer it into the AE role. But I won't lie, I struggled. I did struggle, and I thought it was going to be a seamless transition. I also struggled with the realization that once you transition from SDR to AE, that's kind of it for a bit, because there's no, like, it's very difficult to move from, well, there's obviously organizations, and if you're in the right organization, you can move from AE to senior AE to mid-market AE, enterprise, whatever. But it's also a bit of a, okay, well, I've pushed really hard to get to the SDR to AE piece. What next? Like, how do I progress next? So I think the transition piece was difficult for me, but I really focused on really reflective kind of mentality of looking back, constantly reviewing what I'm doing, but then working very closely with the top performers and getting advice and mentorship externally to try and kind of like draw the circle to a full closure. Because obviously you can do everything internally, work with people internally, but you also need others that have walked in your shoes, been in your shoes, and done things that you want to do to try and get that broader perspective. But it was tough, and I did struggle for the first maybe year in transition, because, and we see the success rate from SDR to AE is pretty low because of that transition being quite a steep learning curve. But also it's the stress of kind of carrying a quota and the kind of unknown, and I call it the conscious competency grid of, like, you're unconsciously incompetent. You don't know why things aren't working, and you obviously have to try and get to conscious competency or unconscious competency where you do things naturally, you don't even have to think about it. So that was a big thing for me, that one of my mentors identified was this conscious competency ladder of trying to get to a point where you don't even have to think about what you're doing, it just works because you know it works.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
And that brings the topic of finding the right mentor, like Hitesh did once in a bar. He spoke to that guy and asked him to become his mentor. And he didn't have his phone at the time, so he also asked him to give him a call the next day so that he could actually mentor him. It didn't work too well, I think.
No, it didn't. Thanks for letting everyone know about that. That was great. Appreciate it. Mate, hey, mate, do you know what a sandwich course is? Just out of interest.
Sandwich
Sorry?
course.
Do you know what a sandwich course is?
Yeah.
It's not where you eat sandwiches, just so you know. All right. So no, Alex, I think you've hit some great points there, I think, especially around mentorship as well. You only know what you know. And so exposing yourself to individuals who know more than you, and as you said, who've walked the right path or the path that you want to walk is extremely important as well. One of the things you mentioned there as well is that the success rate from SDR to AE, obviously, as we know, isn't extremely great. And a huge amount of that is because of the skill set. So the skills that you have in SDR or that you need to succeed are not necessarily always transferable over to an AE. What did you find were those missing skill points? Because you mentioned how you built out a plan, you understood where there were gaps in your skill set, and then you started to build those out. What were some of those skills?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me was the transition of managing all the other, like the management of all the other things that go on top of prospecting. Whether it's like refining your ability to do discovery and really being like seriously strong at doing discovery, because that's where deals are won and made. And I think that was the biggest thing for me that I struggled with, was going from SDR level discovery to AE level discovery, of really understanding the pains, really understanding the why behind they're going to do something, understanding the metrics, understanding how you shape and mold a sales process to benefit the customer, but also benefit yourself in a sense, because you're trying to define and drive a sales process that they may not necessarily want to follow. But I think the areas in which I struggled were, the discovery piece and going the step beyond initial kind of qualification, really, or surface level discovery, and getting beneath the first two levels of pain, surface level pain, and really being able to implicate that pain in the metrics. I think the second one was really around managing everything from pipe gen to managing opportunities to kind of dealing with the internal bringing in of the internal stakeholders, managing internal stakeholders. But then it's also like, who teaches you how to go and draw up some pricing and issue pricing to a customer, and when's the right time to issue pricing, or when's the wrong time to issue pricing? And legal training, I mean, like going through an MSA for the first time and trying to tell a customer, oh, that's a commercial point, or no, that's actually a legal point. Those sorts of things in a lot of organizations just don't get covered. And actually having those sorts of things, almost you have to learn on the job and learn by iteration of doing it several times through. And I think those are some of the things that, if I reflect on how organizations could better prepare SDRs for transition into AE role, is thinking of the full cycle, thinking of everything that happens in a sales process: discovery, demonstration, use case confirmation, metrics, business case. Those are things that SDRs often don't get the exposure to. And I tried my best as an SDR to work or pick maybe one deal a month that I'd follow the AE through, and I'd follow the AE on every single step and be kind of a spectator in those meetings. But it still doesn't really fully prepare you for the reality of going and saying, hey, customer, here's an Mr. Prospect, here's an MSA, let's go and walk you through the MSA and get some red lines from you, because that's a really kind of deer in headlights moment, like, what am I doing here? How am I going to do this? And I think those are the things that perhaps I identified as the challenges, because you just don't get prepared as well as you could be when you're in the SDR seat.
So, like, this is not a plug for Join Flows, but you speak much more about deal management than sales methodology, and deal management being aligning stakeholders, aligning teams, reviewing documents, sticking to timelines. Have you found sales methodology being a better fit for good deal management?
So I'm a massive MEDPIC advocate, and I will use it. And even if the organization I'm not, even if the organization I'm in doesn't use it, I will still use it. And I took Andy White's course, and it was like absolutely massive for me. I was already doing some of it before without realizing, as a lot of people probably do in most sales roles, they do it without realizing. But I think the solidification of, or kind of the, like, confirmation of the need to use it and the way to use it, I think it's that in combination with deal management together are the way to really operate at kind of the optimum level and get that operating rhythm to be as strong as possible. I think, and there's a lot of feedback in the market today around MEDPIC being a kind of seller-centric methodology, and the buyers don't really get anything out of it. And I think there is something to be said about kind of how do you make a sales methodology or sales qualification framework, or whatever you want to call it, beneficial for the buyer, because sometimes it is about the seller trying to get what they need to be able to do what they need to do to get the process through. So I think there's definitely a time and a place for it. I think there's definitely a reason, and you have to try and sell the reason that you're doing it for the benefit of the customer, and really focus on every area of MedPick being of benefit to the customer, and trying to sell each part of that as a benefit to the customer. Because if you don't, it can often be like, you've got a checklist. Okay, what are your metrics? Who's gonna sign off on this? What's the decision? Like, it just feels very transactional, and you've got to kind of bake it into the process very carefully. And I think Scott Finder mentioned the way he does it is at kind of the end of his conversations, he'll bake in a couple of kind of more decision process questions as a kind of way to continually get the information he needs without it feeling like the customer's going through a checklist, which it can be.
Yeah, and something that I think a lot of salespeople do wrongly is they mix up beneficial and enjoyable. Yeah, beneficial does not have to be enjoyable, even if it's for the prospect. And like, there's such a thing as non-enjoyable benefits, like a gap, plugging a gap. Okay, it's not enjoyable, but if you actually plug it, then this becomes enjoyable. And a lot of salespeople try to avoid those difficult conversations. We're a big fan of MedPicks as well. Like, it's baked into our sales methodology. But we tend to see that it's quite hard, especially over long sales cycles, to maintain the relevancy of the data you capture. So how often do you bring up metrics on, like a 2 years deal?
Yeah, so I think, and I work very, very closely with my value consultant on this topic, because we have a lot of data we can capture, and we're very lucky that Coupa has invested very, very heavily into the way we develop business cases. And very often we'll get feedback in the sales process from prospects being like, this is by far and away the most comprehensive business case we've ever seen from a vendor. I think we're also very lucky that we embed the metrics we take from business case into our software, so they can actually track performance. Because often business case gets done in the sales process, shelved, and never looked at again by the prospect. But we make very clear that we're using a business case for their benefit, and that it's going to be tracked, and they can monitor performance against the business case. I think metrics is something that we try and capture in kind of the initial phases, but then B, constantly remind and bring back to the numbers that we've captured. So it'll always be in the appendix of every business case we deliver. It will always be in the appendix, and we can always reference it and say, hey, these are the numbers you gave us. This is what you told us in terms of time spent. This is the kind of volumes you're seeing today. And obviously then there will be times when we have to revisit the numbers, and the business case gets presented and they go, whoa, we don't believe those numbers at all. Let's go back to the calculations and look at how you got to those numbers. So it's always threading into the conversations, but there'll also be times where you'll need to go and say, hey, it's been 6 months since we looked at the numbers. Let's take stock. Let's revisit the numbers, because no doubt they probably will have changed. And it's just making sure that you feel comfortable, really trying to lean on your numbers, and then also thread those into the conversation as often as possible.
Yeah. Nice. Very impressive, Alex. Just a random question and then we can wrap up. But I'm really, what advice would you give yourself, like your younger self, when you started in sales? What would you?
Yeah, it's pretty simple one, I think. Don't rush to transition from SDR to AE. I think I will forever be pinching myself a little bit of like, I wish I'd stayed in the SDR role a little bit longer. And I wish I'd perfected that role more, because I think I was like 90% or 75% baked as an article, as a non-finished article that moved into the AE role, which meant that like I've always been, and doesn't mean to say I can't prospect. It's more of a case of like, if I'd spent more time, I would have seen more things. I probably would have dealt with more things, and probably would have been more efficient in my prospecting that would have served me better in the move to the AE role. And I think there's this, and I said it earlier, like there's this rush from SDR to get to an AE role, but then there was that realization of like, okay, well, we're here now, like what next? So I would go back and I'd probably spend longer in the SDR seat and try and really refine that as a way of as being a seller. And then I think the other one would be just to don't stop asking questions and reflecting on what you've done. And constantly being kind of self-reflection is a big one for me. But there's often times where you go a month and you go, I've not really looked back and like tried to understand what went well this month and what didn't go so well. And I think that's really easy when you kind of don't want to look back because things maybe haven't gone your way. and you don't want to look at the bad things that you've done and things that you missed or things that you didn't do because it just slipped through the net. So those would probably be my sort of 2 or 3 things.
Yeah, so I've got another one because it's very interesting. You spoke about having a mentor, and I'm assuming that some mentors you may have within the same company you're currently at, and then you move on, and then your mentor moves on to a different company. How do you maintain that relationship when the convenience is not here anymore?
Yeah, so I mean, my first one was externally, and I've kind of kept that relationship up, albeit it's more difficult now because that particular individual's moved into more like an operator in a kind of fund style role. But I think it's a kind of like keeping a constant loop of communication, and trying to, even if it's only once a month, right? Like I think once a month is still a good cadence. In my initial phase, I was meeting like once every 2 weeks almost, trying to just get and learn and absorb as much as possible, but also ask questions you don't want to ask internally to your mentor, because there's some things you just don't want to ask your internal mentor or your internal leadership. But it's difficult because things get in the way, life gets in the way, and you have to try and make time for it. And I've kind of seen it on the flip side now, where I actually mentor SDRs that are kind of starting out in their early stages of their career. And the ones that are progressing and moving up and doing well are the ones that actively, proactively reach out and constantly look for communication and say, hey, I want to meet next week. And I'm like, yeah, of course, I'll make time. And I think that's the thing that differentiates those that are kind of stagnant versus those that are really progressing, is the constant dialogue and constant desire to learn. Because I think that's the big thing, right? Is you're seeking mentorship because you want to learn and understand how to improve. And that's a constant kind of thought you need to keep in your mind, is like, okay, well, I'm going to keep the communication constant because I want to keep learning and not kind of stay still in my progression.
Nice.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just the cadence of the meetings, but it's the efficiencies of those as well, making sure they come prepared, understand exactly what it is they're trying to get out of that meeting as well. So yeah, great advice throughout this session, Alex. We are unfortunately out of time, however, but it's been great to have you on. We do have a final wrap-up question that we always ask. So the question is, throughout your whole career to date, what has been your favorite memory so far?
It's a tough one. It's probably actually quite a recent one. So I was 6 months into my journey at Coupa, and yeah, I started working on an opportunity just like before Christmas. And it had legs to kind of move pretty quickly, but I was like, oh god, Christmas, like that's always a bit of a blur, a bit of a challenging time. So yeah, I mean, I think it'd probably be closing a like 145k deal in like 55 days when I was relatively new to the business. But I think the biggest thing was that it was a 2-week blackout period for Christmas, and I took a week of holiday in the first week of January. So basically it was like less than 30 days. And I can't tell you how like stressful it was and how much that we had to do in that short space of time, because I mean, I normally deals like 3 to 6 months here. Yeah, I think that was pretty proud when we got over the line in 31st of January. I think that was probably, yeah, especially as like a new organization, you kind of obviously have a little bit of kind of something to prove. You want to make sure that you kind of are deemed to be what you set out to be in the interview process. So I think that was probably a recent proud moment for me.
Nice.
Amazing. Brilliant. Well, look, Alex, it's been a pleasure having you on. This has been the Revenue Revolution podcast, sponsored by Joint Flows. Until next time, thank you.
Bye bye.